PNR Networks is a member of Patreon. Show your love for our shows by joining our ongoing fundraising campaign and get some fantastic perks in return. Check it out and become a Patreon sponsor. You can sign up at patreon.com, patreon.com/PNR Networks. And thanks for your support.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
It strikes without warning. It is all-encompassing. It fills your heart with dread. It's a world brimming with less than special effects, convoluted plot lines, junk science, and rampant overacting. And you're stuck right in the middle of it. Whether you survive or die depends on the writers, directors, FX artists, and more. And whether it can be taken as serious cinema or serious cheese. You might even say it's an utter disaster. You've just been sucked into the Catastrophe Vortex with T.C. Kirkham.
You know, one of these days I'll actually get to doing these on a regular basis. Welcome to Catastrophe Vortex. I'm T.C. Kirkham. This is the show where we look at disaster movies, disaster TV shows, and a lot more. I've been really lax the last few months, and you guys know it. It's not been any fault of my own. We've just had such a crazy schedule the last few months that it's been hard to keep up. I swear I'm going to get going and try to keep them in place on a weekly basis, at least for now. And I'm going to give you a warning about this, what's going to happen the rest of the month. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to do something a little bit different. Rather than going over a disaster movie, we're going to be doing my favorite dozen episodes of a couple of disaster television shows. And I'll tell you why I picked these and the reasons behind my like for it, and urge you to look them up yourself. Next week, hopefully next week, we will be looking at my top 12 episodes of the National Geographic series Seconds from Disaster. This week, however, we're going to start with the longest running disaster series in history. It is now in its 18th season on Canadian television, and it is available around the world on different television networks. In Canada, it's called Mayday. In America, currently, it's called Air Disasters, and it airs on the Smithsonian Channel. Most new episodes Sunday evenings at 8 o'clock with repeats daily at 6 p.m. and occasionally at other times. I just found out when I was doing research for this that they've just launched their 18th season in Canada. And the reason I like this show is because it has a lot of discussions with both people that were involved with the disaster, and also the officials who investigated it in many cases. I find the investigations behind these really fascinating. I am not an engineer. I'm not necessarily an aviation fan. In fact, I don't really like to fly. But I find the show fascinating. Now, this is going to be a little bit different. So if you're listening in Canada, I'm going to tell you that we're going to focus strictly on the airline accidents or airplane accidents that have been featured on Mayday. Mayday has also featured a few train crashes, a few other things along the lines. I'm going strictly by the air disasters that have aired on the Air Disasters television show. It actually aired here earlier under the original title Mayday, and also under Air Emergency on a couple of other networks. But it has been running pretty steadily for the past 7 or 8 years on Smithsonian. These particular episodes I've chosen are ones that have fascinated me mainly because of the accident itself, or because of the people involved that were on the show that had a lot to talk about it, the circumstances surrounding it. I haven't seen a bad episode of Air Disasters. I mean, they're all fascinating to me. I like watching how the investigators go through and really break it down from beginning to end on what happened on board these planes. Sometimes they've made it out with most people surviving. Other times they have not. And I'm going to be very opinionated on why I like these. If there are alternate titles, and that has happened a few times, when I post the top 12 list on the website later this week, I will include the order with the original Mayday title, the Canadian title. If there is an alternate American title, I will list it in parentheses in the description, so you'll get a look at the whole top 12 of them. These have fascinated me for one reason or another, and I think the circumstances and how the crew handles things in some of these were really amazing. I don't know if you guys remember from about a year ago when I talked about the film CVR, which was a play originally and then it became a film, that are reenactments of actual conversations based on the cockpit voice recorders. That's a lot of what goes on here is fascinating in that way too. So let's get started. I'll tell you the season and the stuff about the disaster itself and why I like it. And hopefully you'll seek these out and watch them when they air in your area on Air Disasters or on Mayday in reruns. All of these are from prior. I have to admit, I've seen a lot of these over the years, but all of my top 12 have come prior to the Canadian series 12th season or before. So it's interesting that although I like them all, and like I said, they've all had interesting circumstances. For one reason or another, these are the ones that really captured my attention. So let's get started. My number 12 episode of Air Disasters of all time was Desperate Escape. It first aired in Canada as part of the 4th season. It was the season premiere for the 4th season, actually, originally airing on April 15th, 2007 in Canada. Desperate Escape covers the overrun on the runway of Air France Flight 358 on August 2nd, 2005. I find this really fascinating, this episode, because number one, the plane caught fire as it landed shortly after a thunderstorm in Toronto, was not able to stop in time, went off the hill at the end of the Toronto runway, caught fire, and yet, miraculously, everyone survived. Although, a lot of people who were relatives didn't realize this right away, because Air France took an interminably long time to let other people know, that the relatives know that their loved ones were safe and being sequestered in another part of the airport so they could be interviewed about the disaster. The family that's interviewed on the episode, in fact, who are from Canada and they had been to France to visit relatives, I believe, had their son running around waiting to pick them up, thinking they'd all died in this crash. And it was a pretty terrible thing for Air France to do. They could have at least said, everyone's okay, you'll see them in a little while. It was a little bit, it wasn't well handled by the airline, I didn't think. This was investigated by the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, and they eventually found that the causes were involving the slick runway. The fact that they overshot was because they didn't hit the right mark when they came down, because they were trying to do a smooth landing without causing problems, but they ended up too far down the runway and didn't have time to do the thrust reversers fast enough. So that's how come the plane ended up going off the edge of the off the edge of the into the ravine at the end of the runway. The footage of this, there's a lot of amateur video footage because Toronto's airport happens to run right next to the city's biggest artery, highway artery. A lot of amateur footage of the plane on fire, of survivors straggling up the hill to the road where people were stopping and helping them and giving them a lift to the airport and trying to get things straightened out. It's a fascinating look at it. It was the plane type was an Airbus A340-300, and they hadn't had too many accidents with that plane at that time. It's definitely worth checking out. Usually runs in the repeat cycles of the show here in America. My number 11 is Bomb on Board from the third season, episode 5, and it is mostly not so much the actual accident that interested me, but in the way it was looked at. It's actually a very detailed analysis of the early activities of terrorist Ramzi Youssef. He planted a bomb on board Philippines Airlines Flight 434 on the second leg of service from Manila to Tokyo via Cebu City, which was where he was in the Philippines. During the second leg of the flight, the bomb exploded, killed the passenger that was sitting above it because he had slipped it into the container underneath the seat after getting it ready in the lavatory. He got off before anyone else got on that plane. He was long gone. This episode details Youssef's early work, and he would later be connected to the original terrorist bombing at the World Trade Center. He was wanted around the world for what was happening. He was known to be a very active terrorist in this line, and was trying to try out some of his stuff before he moved on to bigger and better targets, according to him, which would be pretty much anything that the United States was involved with. The crew did successfully land the plane. Only the one passenger that was right over the bomb perished in the accident. They did successfully land at Naha Airport in Okinawa during the second leg of the flight. It's interesting to watch the various organizations as they look into how the bomb happened. They come, in fact, Youssef comes very close to being caught here. And it's an interesting look at the way a terrorist thinks about things. They get into the psych areas about what their motivations are and such. The fascinating, it's a very dark episode because, of course, it's a dark theme, but it's dark in color also because a lot of it is in poorly lit hotel rooms, and watching him dodge in and out of rain and everything to try and get away from authorities. It's a very interesting episode, knowing the kind of terrorists successfully terrorizing that he did over the years. And it's hoped that I don't think he's going to see the light of day anytime soon. Of course, he is in prison here in the United States, so I don't really think he's going to be out among us. The type of plane was a Boeing 747-200B, and kudos to the crew for managing to get down and get the rest of the passengers off safely. That could not have been easy to do. Let me find the captain's name here. I want to make sure we shout it out if I can. The tourists, the people on board at the time flying the plane were... where is it? It was here. I lost it. This is what happens when I have to have 5 different things open doing these shows. Captain Reyes of the airline managed to get it down. He was having trouble after the bomb went off with the control. He was worried about the hydraulics. He actually was interviewed for the show and said that he feared disengaging the autopilot would cause the airplane to bank right and he would lose control of the craft. but they managed to do. He and co-pilot Herrera did what they needed to do to get it down, and they definitely deserve kudos for that. So that's number 11 on my list. Number 10 is Out of Control from the third season, episode 3, and it is the detail of the worst single-plane aircraft disaster in history. Japan Airlines Flight 123, which crashed into a mountain 12 minutes into the flight it was on August 12th, 1985, killing 520 passengers and crew. Only 4 people survived, although more may have survived had anyone realized there were survivors. It took almost 14 hours to get to the plane because of where it was in the mountains in Japan, Otsutaka Ridge, near Mount Otsutaka. There may have been more survivors, and probably were, when the plane first crashed. But the rescuers decided to bunk down for the night further down the mountain, believing incorrectly that all had perished. It was a fascinating accident because it actually happened because of something so small, you would think so insignificant, and yet one wrong thing, boom. They had a tail strike 7 years earlier as Japan Airlines Flight 115, and it had damaged the rear pressure bulkhead. The repairs that were done were not conforming to Boeing's approved repair methods, and at this particular point in time, after stress of landing and taking off over and over again over the 7 years, it finally worked itself free, and it was just a terrible, terrible accident. There was a movie made about it, a semi-autobiographical movie. Shizumano Taiyo, which stars Ken Watanabe. They don't mention the actual airline, and it looks mostly at the corporate disputes and politics surrounding the crash. Japan Airlines did not cooperate with the film, and the actual incident is also one of the scripts that are part of Charlie Victor Romeo. So if you've seen that, you've heard some of the dialogue that went back and forth between the crew of the plane and the air traffic controllers. It was, as I said, the single biggest disaster in airline history. The only disaster that beats it is the Tenerife air crash, which involved 2 planes, and in 1977. And this one, when you think about the recreations that they show, and of course, they're going on using the actual voice footage here, cockpit voice recorder, to reenact what's happening. But if it really happened, and it probably did, the way that it's shown in the show, I can imagine that was the most terrifying 10 minutes of these poor people's lives. And it would have been outrageous. The idea of the way they were rising and falling, having trouble turning, it would have been terrifying. As I said, the loss of 520, including both all passengers and crew, only 4 survivors, and it was an amazing, horrible accident. It was a Boeing 747 SR-46, and its original destination had been Osaka after taking off at Haneda Airport in Tokyo. That's number 10 on the list. The Out of Control from the third season. Number 9 on my list is one that I found fascinating because of the actors in this play, in the TV play. Because, excuse me, this the cockpit was charged with, nervousness and emotion, because you've got something that's completely unheard of happening. And it was this near disaster, thankfully it did not end badly, that woke up the world to the dangers of volcanic eruptions and airplanes. My number 9 from season 4 is Falling from the Sky. It involved a British Airways flight from the 4th season, episode 2. And this, I can't even imagine what went through the heads of these gentlemen flying this plane when they're just, tooling along like normal. Doesn't look like it's going to be a really seriously bad flight. They're on a flight from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, to Perth, Australia, and everything looks fine. Suddenly, the captain's out of the cockpit for a few moments, and during his absence, we start seeing little lights outside the windows, and the engines start acting up. They initially called it St. Elmo's fire, and it was a glow that surrounded the plane, basically. Within a few minutes, all 4 engines on this Boeing 747-200B had flamed out. Now, kudos to the crew, and I'll name them here in a minute, because the way that they're portrayed in the actual show makes them, you really start seeing the kind of fortitude that some pilots have when it comes down to this. They knew they had to get the engines restarted. They had no idea why all 4 engines had failed. They did know that there was an odd odor and some smoke in the passenger cabin as they were flying and as this was happening. So they immediately began doing the checklist to restart the engines. They went through it a number of times, and they knew, although the plane was gliding, it was slowly sinking, they knew they had to get them started again, or the plane would eventually crash wherever they were with nowhere to go. I can't even imagine what they were thinking, and they, of course, had no idea that at the time they actually flew straight through a cloud of volcanic ash from a volcano that had gone off in the area of Jakarta just a few hours before the flight. The flight crew consisted of Senior First Officer Roger Greaves and Senior Engineer Officer Barry Townley Friedman. They were the first to notice it. Captain Eric Moody was using the lavatory when it first started to happen, but was back in the cockpit after just a few minutes. These 3 men won numerous awards for their calmness in the storm. They were able to talk occasionally to air traffic control and let them know what was going on, although it took a while to get it through because it was very sketchy, because the power levels were low, because of the fact that the engines also power the electricity in the plane for the most part. This was a fascinating episode. When the plane landed, all were okay, and a good deal of the paint on the side of the planes with the British Airways logo had been pretty much sanded away. The windshields were sandblasted, completely opaque. They still managed to land okay once they got the engines restarted, and it was a pretty harrowing incident, I would imagine. One of the passengers, Betty Tootle, who was also interviewed for Mayday / Air Disaster episode, wrote a book about her experiences on this flight. All 4 engines have failed. You can still find it. It is a little expensive because it's out of print, but you still can get it at Amazon and a few other places. Hats off to the crew on this flight and for getting it out there. You'll hear them refer to the flight as Speedbird 9 throughout the episode. It was British Airways Flight 9 on June 24th, 1982. And I can't even imagine what a quadruple flameout must have done to their psyche. Another British Airways incident from a few years later actually is my number 8. The episode is called Blowout. It was from the 2nd season. And this, again, this almost seems like that whole stiff upper lip thing for the Brits. Captain Tim Lancaster, or Lancaster, whichever way it's properly pronounced, almost got sucked out of the plane when the windscreen failed and blew out on the captain's side. He was pulled out, but was hooked up against the window frame, but pressed outside of the plane. It was literally pressed up against the top of the plane, out the window. It was an explosive decompression incident, obviously, and they did manage to land the plane with no problems. There were 87 people on board. It happened. They did actually perform an emergency landing at Southampton Airport. They had left Birmingham in England on their way to Malaga in Spain, Malaga Airport, on this day at 17,400 feet. So they weren't up to full cruising altitude yet, is when the panel failed, and this happened on June 10th, 1990. Again, the crew, co-pilot Atchison and his, Alistair Atchison and his, does it give the engineer's name? No, it doesn't give the engineer's name. One of them was holding on to Captain Tim Lancaster, or Lancaster, as he hung out to make sure that they were going to be able to hold on to him. Surprisingly, he was not seriously injured. He was suffering a bit from hypothermia, but he managed to pull out of it and made a full recovery. He was working at British Airways again within 5 months. During the actual accident, flight attendant suffered a dislocated shoulder. Everyone else got off without anything happening, which is really good. So again, kudos to the crew of British Airways Flight 5390 on June 10th. 1990, saving not just their passengers, but their captain as well. In Season 5, Episode 2, I saw one of the most outlandishly crazy episodes of this show. And it is so infamous among Canadian air people that if you know anything about air disasters or even accidents that didn't cause any major fatalities, you've probably heard of the Gimli glider. From Season 5, Episode 2, number 7 on my list. This happened way back in 1983. And it happened because they put the incorrect amount of fuel in the plane when they took off. They were originally they took off from Ottawa International Cartier Airport, destined for Edmonton, after their original flight had started in Montreal, but the fuel that was put in the plane was calculated and approved without being noticed in gallons rather than, liters? I'm sorry, I'm not very good with the metric system. So there was half the amount of fuel on the plane that there should have been. And halfway through the flight, they ran out of fuel, although their gauges still said they were working, that they still had plenty of fuel because the gauges weren't working. The two pilots on board this flight one of them, Captain Bob Peterson, was an experienced glider pilot also, as well as a longtime employee of Air Canada. And First Officer Maurice Quinal was actually flying the plane that day when all this happened. They ended up coming to a stop in a nice, soft fashion compared to what it could have been at a former Royal Canadian Air Force base at Gimli, Manitoba, that had been turned into a motor racing track. There were actually cars on part of what they were going to use as a runway. Thankfully, the people saw the plane coming in, got their cars out of the way. There were a few minor injuries, but no fatalities, no bad things happening. Most of the injuries happened during the evacuation. So for the 69 passengers and crew on board, it was probably a pretty intense flight. But they couldn't have had two more experienced pilots at the wheel. Captain Pearson did get a demotion for 6 months for not noticing the fuel differences on the sheet he was handed to sign, but they both continued to fly for Air Canada for a while, and the first officer has since passed away. And it's definitely one of those little things that can go wrong, but has a really happy ending. Again, they did a great job with the dramatizations on this film, on this flight. And it was actually, although it's known as the Gimli Glider, it was actually Air Canada Flight 143. If you're not a disaster fan and you think the name Gimli is familiar, as I was when I first saw it, it's probably because you might be a fan of filmmaker Guy Maddin. Guy Maddin is originally from Winnipeg and had a movie called Tales from the Gimli Hospital. That was his first breakthrough film, a little more than a decade ago. And so that might be where that familiarity might come from. Number 7 on my list, Gimli Glider from the 5th season. My wife is not much into disaster stuff, and she doesn't like the real life stuff either. I mean, some of these have really upset me as well. I mean, I used to be able to sit and watch these without getting emotional until I saw number 6. This was the first one that I saw, and I remember when it happened, being on the news when it happened. This was the first one I saw that just outraged me, and I was glad to hear that they'd taken care of the problem. When I was watching it again on another repeat, my wife was fascinated with it as well, because Air Disasters / Mayday has covered a number of episodes that involve murder-suicide, but none quite as heinous as I'm the Problem from Season 11, Episode 10. This happened to Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771 and took place, ironically, on December 7th, 1987, which, if you know dates, that's Pearl Harbor Day. A man named David Burke had been fired from his job at U.S. Air, which was the parent company of Pacific Southwest Airlines. He knew that the man who had fired him, his boss, who had put him on probation a few weeks before, took this flight back and forth between Los Angeles and San Francisco every day to work. He boarded the plane that afternoon after meeting with Ray Thompson, who said he would not be rehired, bought a ticket for the plane, brought his gun with him, and after the plane took off and they were safely into the air, Burke went to the bathroom, pulled out his gun after dropping off a threatening note to the man who was sitting a few rows ahead of him, came back out with his gun, shot his ex-boss twice, then shot a flight attendant, both pilots, and then possibly another pilot who was on board the plane. It is believed that Burke was alive when the plane crashed into a mountainside north of Cerritos, California, just a few minutes after it took off. 43 passengers and crew were killed, and Burke they were able to find because part of the flesh of his finger, or his thumb, I forget which, was caught in the gun, which was found shortly after the crash happened. They knew that there were shots fired because they had reported it, and it was heard on the air traffic control over the communications, although they never really got to communicate it. They had been in the air for 1 hour and 12 minutes when this heinous murder attempt happened. the viciousness of this and others that air disaster has covered is outrageous. The idea of killing an entire plane of innocent people to kill either yourself or one person aboard it. This is true evil to me. I can't even fathom what the families of these poor people went through so close to Christmas that year, and the senselessness of it all. If they hadn't found the note, they may not have known exactly what happened, but the note that Bert delivered to Ray as he walked by survived the crash, mainly because the plane hit so hard that it essentially disintegrated and pushed into the hill, and there was a giant explosion of papers that came out of the plane and landed around it before the small fire that happened. There's been a number of other episodes dealing with this where a pilot or a co-pilot has deliberately downed a plane. Most recently was an episode about the Germanwings incident in 2015. This one, my wife was in shock when she saw this. I'm like, you got to be. She's like, how could you do that? How could you be such a gigantic monster? I don't know. I don't know that anybody will. Pilot Greg Lindemood and co-pilot James Nunn didn't even have a chance. They heard the gunshot before they could do anything. He was killing the flight attendant and shooting them. And it's just one of the most riveting and terrifying episodes they've ever done. About Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771 from December 7th, 1987. Number 6 on my list. I'm the problem. So we're up to my top 5. These are the 5 that I watch more than any of them, because when they're on, I have it set to record on my DVR, whether I've seen it or not, every day. So I end up with like 8 or 9 episodes by the end of the week. And sometimes I'll go through and get rid of them. I'm not really in the mood to watch them, or I didn't like them that well. But there are ones that I will usually watch over and over again. Number 5 is one of those because I remember the news footage, and I remember being utterly terrified when I saw this on the news. And yet, until I saw air disasters, I did not know that despite this plane, despite what happened, more than 50% of the passengers survived. And considering what you see on screen, and they've actually got the footage that was shown all over the news for this episode, it's really, really amazing. Number 5, Impossible Landing from season 11, episode number 13. It concerns flight 232 United Airlines, July 19th, 1989, which had a catastrophic failure of its flight controls after a tail-mounted engine burst. And I will never figure out how everyone in the cockpit survived, let alone over half the passengers. When you see this plane come in for a landing with no control in Sioux City, Iowa, and you see it flip over on its side and start to burn, it's an amazing, terrifying sight. This goes into all of the behind-the-scenes stuff, and especially, again, the credit to the actors handling the roles of the people that were involved with this. This crash was on the news over and over again for 3 or 4 days after it happened, as they started to take an assessment of who survived, who didn't, and what had happened. Captain Alfred C. Haynes was in charge of the plane. First Officer William Records, Second Officer Dudley Dvorak, and a training check airman, Dennis Rich, were all on board. And it was the good thing that they had so many people able to help out with the situation. They were on the phone with their people at United about what they could do to help try to get some control back. They experimented and got what they could. there is a picture on the Wikipedia page about which shows the plane landing. It's almost like at a 15-degree angle to the right, and it just gets worse from there. It never ceases to amaze me that so many people did get out alive. There were 111 fatalities in the crash, but 185 people, crew and passengers, managed to get out alive. The plane had taken off from Stapleton Airport in Denver. It had stopped over in O'Hare in Chicago and was en route to Philadelphia when the accident occurred. And the crew, wow, they handled this the best they could, and they still managed to help save, their landing. And even though it was crashed, they did their best. The fact that they were able to have more than 50% of the passengers walk away from such a heinous crash is pretty amazing. There's been all kinds of different stories about this done. It's also been featured on Seconds from Disaster. It has had a TV movie made about it, a couple of them actually, a few other specials. It also is in Charlie Victor Romeo, and there have been a number of stories of the people. Dennis Fitch is interviewed extensively in the episode. He's also interviewed for Seconds from Disaster, if I remember right. And he wasn't actually on duty. He was just there to help. And it was just an amazing, crazy situation. The way you see this happen, it is really a miracle that anyone got through it, and that is to the kudos of the people involved. Number 5 on my list, impossible landing, which was, as I said, United Airlines Flight 232 in July 19th, 1989. My number 4, I admit this one is a guilty pleasure because of the interview with the first officer for this show. It was the season premiere on season 12 of Mayday. It is called Fight for Control. It concerned smaller prop airline Revolution Airlines flying out of where were they out of? They were headed to Seattle from Cold Bay Airport in Cold Bay, Alaska, when one of the engine props came off of the engine and struck the bottom of the plane, cutting through the hydraulic lines. And I've got to say this. There were only 10 passengers, but all 10 and all the crew survived. They did manage to make an emergency landing in Anchorage a couple of hours later. James Gibson, the captain, and his co-pilot Gary Lintner, and the flight engineer Gerald Moose Lauren. If they were really like, and I'll be honest, I think they probably were. They were really like the people who played them in this episode. This must have been a hell of a flight. Gibson comes across as almost a John Wayne type. And First Officer Lintner is very obviously his junior, but also very experienced. Lintner was interviewed extensively for this episode, and his flip, almost sarcastic demeanor about some of the stuff that happened was hilarious. I've never laughed really, really hard at an episode of this show until this one came along. This is another one of the ones that I've shown my wife, and she was laughing too, because he was just like, well, when this happened, oh man, we knew it was gonna, the crap was gonna hit the fan, something like that. I'm like, okay. They did successfully get down. It did leave a huge hole in the bottom of the plane where the propeller hit it. Moose Lauren, the engineer, later married the flight attendant on that particular flight. They were working closely together, helping get her back and forth to the passengers over this foot-wide hole in the floor of the plane where you could see down into the ocean. This is just really interesting to watch because you get such a great, vivid detail from First Officer Lintner in his interview. It's I don't know how to put it. It just seems almost like it was a script for a John Wayne film. In fact, it actually did remind me slightly of The High and the Mighty. If you've ever seen it, you might get that same kind of idea. But it's an excellent episode. The recreation of the flight is pretty harrowing, and as I said, the interview from First Officer Lintner is a classic. Number 4, Fight for Control from season 12, episode 1, and that was that occurred once again to Revolution Airways Flight 8 on June 8th, 1983. Another episode my wife watched with me just last week is one I think I've watched this one more than any other episode except my number 1. And the reason is because the circumstances are crazy, but the circumstances behind the man flying the plane are even crazier. And this man, I'm sorry, I've got to be honest, if I ever met this man, not likely, but if I ever did, I'd probably drop to my knees and do a "we're not worthy" for this guy. Because this guy pulled this off with one eye. Taka Flight 110 happened on May 24th, 1988. It was the subject of episode Nowhere to Land from season 11, episode 11. Taka was flying over the Gulf of Mexico during storm season back in May of 1988, coming up from from Belize and headed for New Orleans. As they closed in near to America, they accidentally entered what they thought was a rain shower, but turned out to be an extremely severe thunderstorm. Water overpowered the engines of the brand new Boeing 737-310 that they were flying. Taka Airlines had only accepted delivery on the plane just a few days earlier, and they were excited about flying this plane because they wanted to deliver it, and they didn't want to get it scratched up or anything. The engines flamed out for no apparent reason during this. They didn't know that the water would be so crazy. But they knew that they did not have enough lift at the point, because they were already starting in for their landing, to get to the airport. Captain Carlos Dardano, a native of El Salvador, made a perfect dead stick landing on a grass levee outside of New Orleans with no injury to the aircraft, minor injury, no one on board getting any more than minor injuries, and he did it with one eye, which means his depth perception was not there. Dardano had lost an eye a number of years earlier after it was shot out when he was flying a small plane in between some of the stuff that happened in his native El Salvador in the 1980s. A couple of guerrillas shot through the plane. This guy has chutzpah like you would not believe. He's extensively interviewed in the episode, and the more I listen to him and the more I enjoy the stories he's telling, I keep thinking this guy truly deserves the title of Balls of Steel. He is an amazing pilot. I think under good conditions, flying with one eye has got to be difficult, but he has managed to maintain that until he retired a couple of years ago, with a pretty decent safety record. Both of his kids, his daughter and his son, have followed in his footsteps for these smaller airlines in their native country. And he was just 29 at the time he'd done this, and I'm like, how in the world? I mean, this, like I said, this guy has balls of steel. It's fascinating because there really wasn't anything wrong with the plane. They didn't realize that these engines would sock out in such heavy weather. As again, it happened on May 24th, 1988, Taka Flight 110, the subject of episode number 3, my number 3 air disasters episode, Nowhere to Land from the 11th season. At number 2 is one of those worst case scenarios that you hope will turn out well. Thankfully, it did. It may not have, but it did, and if it hadn't, it would have been one of the biggest disasters in history. It was pretty amazing that just one little thing happened to cause this plane to have so much problems. The episode from Air Disasters Mayday was called Turning Point, and it's from season 11, episode 6, and concerns Northwest Flight 85 on October 9th, 2002. It was on a long-haul flight from Detroit to Tokyo, and they had just managed. They had a dual crew on board that was each going to fly half of the way to Narita in Tokyo, and it was just after they passed out of the Anchorage air traffic control area and into this dead zone that's between Alaska and Japan that they suffered a rudder hard over, and everything changed. These guys, I'm swearing, is something else. At the time the incident occurred, they had just turned over the aircraft to the junior crew, Junior Captain Frank Gelb and First Officer Mike Fagan, while Senior Captain John Hansen and First Officer David Smith had gone off to get some rest, and they would handle the landing when they got to Tokyo. They felt it go crazy when this suddenly happened, and came back to the cockpit. The four of them were eventually able to figure out what was happening and managed to relay word through another plane to Anchorage what was happening and trying to get the plane to turn around, because when the rudder hard over happens, you're stuck because the rudder doesn't move. The plane wants to go in one direction and also wants to roll. And there have been a lot of rudder hard over accidents that have had tremendous fatalities, such as Queens right after 9/11 and a few other ones. These guys, again, balls of steel. Captain Hansen jumped back into the senior captain's seat while First Officer Mike Fagan stayed in the first officer's seat, fighting to keep control of this plane for the 3 or 4 hours it took them to get back to an emergency landing at Anchorage. They did so successfully with 404 people on board, crew and passengers. And this was a relatively new plane as well, a Boeing 747-451, when it happened. Watching the calmness and how they handle this, and the actors, again, they had interviews with several of the people, including Captain Hansen, and it was pretty. I can't even imagine what that man went through trying to keep this plane under control for 4 hours, trying to get it back to Anchorage. Insane. These guys deserve every award they could possibly get, and they crew resource management was in perfect sync, where they were all working to make sure that the plane got down safely. Watch this one. It's really exciting and nail biting, and these guys, the actors and the people involved, there were interviews with several of them, as well as the experts, that really make it worthwhile. The hardover happened because a little tiny, like an O-ring type thing, fell off of its rod and let the rudder get stuck in its track, and it wouldn't move anywhere else. Boeing issued a inspection process for it, and eventually a replacement for it, to try and stop this from happening, because there had been other incidents that didn't come out so well with this kind of an issue. It was fascinating. Number 2 on my list, Turning Point, featuring Northwest Airlines Flight 85 on October 9th, 2002. My favorite episode of Air Disasters, if I can actually say that, I mean, that sounds kind of crass, but it's my favorite in the way that this is the true crew that you want on board a plane when you have something happen. Crew resource management, a lot of the earlier accidents that Air Disasters / Mayday has covered was because of the lack of CRM, as it's called in the industry. And once CRM became widespread and was finally spreading throughout the entire airline industry and other industries, things got a lot more in sync between people involved. This crew was amazing, and they had what could have been the biggest disaster in the history of Airbus if they had not figured out what was going on. Number one on my favorite episodes of Air Disasters is from the 10th season, the final episode of the season, Titanic in the Sky. This happened on November 4th, 2010 to Qantas Flight 32. It was a flight from Singapore, a flight to London from Singapore to Singapore, where they would change crews, and then their final destination was Sydney. The accident just started with the relief crew that had boarded in Singapore. And I mean, wow, okay. This was nuts. After just a few moments after takeoff, the first officer was in control of the plane at the time, and an uncontained failure of the inboard engine, number 2 engine, happened while they were climbing over Batam Island in Indonesia. It punctured part of the wing, damaged the fuel system, causing leaks, a fuel tank fire, disabled one whole hydraulic system, and the anti-lock braking system. It caused the engines that were remaining to go into a degraded mode, damaged the flaps, damaged the controls. You name what could go wrong with this plane, it went wrong with this plane. This was, I think, perhaps the most nerve-wracking of all of these, except the one I just spoke about at number 2. Captain Richard Champon de Crespigny from Australia he was very cool. We got an extensive interview with him in this. I gotta say, the dude playing him didn't look anything like him. I mean, that's not unusual with shows like this, but man, there wasn't even a close resemblance in this one. He was and is the Sully of Australia. Chesley Sullenberg, for what happened on this flight. This was the first Qantas plane feature of the first Airbus A380 in the Qantas fleet, and they had taken it up, and this was his Captain de Crespigny was the first captain in Qantas qualified to fly these as the captain. He'd been doing so for a couple of years at this point, if I remember right. There were actually 5 pilots on board this flight. There normally would have only been 3. In addition to Captain de Crespigny, there was also his first officer, an engineer, and then there was a Czech officer on board that was doing his de Crespigny's annual flight check. This is a common thing in airlines where you get checked out for what you do and how you're doing by another pilot every year. I was blown. This was the A380 is currently the largest plane in the air. It holds over 500 people. This particular flight held 469 passengers and crew, and was the 842 model of the A380. Completely computerized. in most areas, run by the gigantic Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engines that are the only thing that could maybe close short of a rocket engine to be able to get an airplane of this size off the ground. I was so impressed with this crew. I wish there had been. I wish I could get more info on the other officers, but it's not listed here, unfortunately, where I'm looking. But they also had an interview with the Czech captain and with the second in command, the first officer that day in this episode. And talk about cool under pressure. These guys, they really outperformed. These are the captains I want on my plane. If I ever get on a plane, I want these guys in charge of it. Because if something goes wrong, there's a good chance these guys are going to get me down to the ground and not, off to the great airport in the sky, if you know what I mean. It was really, really something. My number one air disasters episode of all time, Titanic in the Sky, Qantas Flight 32 from November 4th, 2010. I will have a list of these up later in the week, and I will note, as I said at the beginning of the show, I will note if they have an alternate title in the U.S. These are all Canadian titles. And there is a chart of the different titles on the Wikipedia episodes listing for the show for Australia and the UK, and where else is it at? It's Australia, UK, and Australia and Asia and the UK. So if there is a different title, I will have it on the notes. But I hope you've enjoyed this little retrospect. It's not the kind of thing I normally do, but I'm doing it this month because I'm still trying. I'll be honest with you here. March is insane in what we do. We are based out of Boston, and every year, March and April and early May is festival season. This year, there are 10 festivals, 2 film series, and 5 of those festivals are running at least partly the same weekend. Next weekend, March 21st through the 25th or 26th. We are scrambling to try. We're a 2-person operation. We are scrambling to try and cover all of them, because we always give our best possible coverage to our local film festivals. So that's the reason why I did this countdown, and next week will be a Seconds from Disaster countdown. I will be taking the week after that on Monday off. That is the 26th, because that is the day the new computer system at my place of employment, is going online, and I am going to be frazzled beyond belief. Once we get past that, in early April, I will be back with more great movies. I'm hoping to start with the Towering Inferno, but I do have... I haven't watched Geostorm yet. It's now available. I've heard it is absolutely dreadful. But I haven't seen it yet, so I may take that in. There's a couple of other ones I'm interested in catching, too. And with just the one movie a show format, it works a lot better. I hope that will... Hope that will work out, and that will be starting in April. And next week, as I said, day and date, I believe, would be the 19th of March. We will do our count-up of my favorite Seconds from Disaster shows. I hope you'll check out all of our other shows as well. Subject Cinema, Saturdays now, in the evening, usually around 9 o'clock. Great reviews, commentary, everything else with myself and my lovely wife, Kim Brown. Our spin-off of Subject Cinema, Front Row 5 and 10, Thursdays. Goofy, entertainment-oriented lists, everything from books to movies to music and everything in between. And those are always fun to do because we don't tell each other what our picks for each of our lists are until we talk about them. I have 2 mini shows throughout the week. Tuesday Digidex, which is the latest home video releases, and Friday and 3-Minute Weekend on Friday, the latest theatrical releases. Both of those are U.S.-centric. We also have my wife's other 2 shows, Plaid and Rose's Garden, every Sunday, covering the wonderful world of Supernatural and the Winchester brothers therein. And she has a brand new podcast, Ring Around the Rosie, all about her 30-plus years as a fan of professional wrestling, plus recaps of Raw and SmackDown every week, and her opinions therein. Neither one of her shows are safe for work. We also have Cavebabble with Garrick and Valerie Lyon at cavebabble.com, and Comic Grotto, all comics all the time, with Aunt B and Pee Wee at comicgrotto.com. You can get Subject Cinema, Front Row 5 and 10, 3-Minute Weekend, and Tuesday Digidex at eCinemaOne.com, and Kim's shows you can get on her sites, PlatinumRosesDarting.com and RingaroundTheRosie.net. And don't forget to check out our websites as well, eCinemaOne, eCinemaBoston, and everything else that goes on in between. eCinemaBoston is going to have tons of festival stuff in the next few weeks. So if you're into film festivals, come check it out. You might find some good films to keep an eye out for in your local festival in the near future. I also want to remind you to please, when you're listening to this show or checking out one of our sites, please subscribe, please share, and please be sure to like on Facebook and tweet on Twitter. And also, please have it within you to become a Patreon patron. We're trying desperately to get some new equipment. We can't afford it on our own, and we definitely need your help. The quickest way to do that is to become a patron. You get all kinds of perks, your choice at your level. They're going to be revised in the near future, but it's going to be still similar to what we've got now. You can do it for as little as $2 a month, and we hope that you'll join us at patreon.com/PNRNetworks. And the Patreon, it covers everybody. Everybody gets a take of it. Everybody gets a chunk of what comes in. So hopefully you will become a patron as well. Until next time, when I'm back with my favorite episodes of Seconds from Disaster, I'm the Master of Disaster, T.C. Kirkham. I'll see you next time on Catastrophe Vortex. Bye-bye.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
Podcasting's choice. From coast to coast, continent to continent, right here 24/7.
The Empire!